Good number of attendees online today. Thank you for joining us for another AWP webinar presented in 2020 through the Advanced Work Packaging Community of Practice group. Today we're joined by Lloyd Rankin and Vince Darter, Lloyd representing Group ASI and Vince representing Brand Safeway, to talk AWP in action. We're going to look at some different scenarios and talk about what looks different with AWP implementation. I mentioned this was presented through the AWP Community of Practice. If you're not already a member, we recommend checking out linkedin.com and looking for Advanced Work Packaging Community of Practice. We'll share this slideshow with all attendees after the presentation today, and you can access the group directly through the link you see on screen. And that group is basically an effort to create a community for knowledge sharing, discussion, promotion for adoption of advanced work packaging and other related construction productivity initiatives throughout global industry. We offer other sort of value add services to the members of the community through 2020, and our weekly webinar series has been well received so far, and we're looking forward to presenting more of these. We want to hear your feedback on topics you'd like to see. If you have questions or comments for any of the presenters of any of the webinars, we definitely encourage you to go online and then post those questions and comments there and continue the conversation. As mentioned, Vince Darter, Director of Technical Services for Brand Safeway, and Lloyd Rankin, President of Group ASI, will present today's topic. We will have Q&A opportunities at the back end of the presentation. But for now, I'm going to give Vince and Lloyd the most time available to present their topics. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Vince to introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Steve, and I'd like to thank everybody for taking an hour out of their day-to-day to engage in this endeavor. Again, Vince Darter, I'm Director of Technical Services for Brand Safeway. I office in the Houston area, Pasadena specifically. And so, as you can see on the bio here, I've started my career about 40 years ago in the insulation industry. But I've had the good fortune in my career path of being exposed to a lot of project management and controls, estimating, planning, scheduling, and more specifically, in the last few years, our focus has really been on integration of technology as a delivery support mechanism for some of our tools on projects, and assisting on AWP implementations on projects where those concepts are being deployed. So Lloyd, a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Vince. Lloyd Rankin here. I started working with COA back in the early 2000s as the researcher that helped them pull together the WorkFace Planning model. And then I was one of 4 Canadians on the RT272 that helped to develop the advanced work packaging model. I've been involved in doing auditing, training, consulting around WorkFace Planning and advanced work packaging for close to 20 years now. And we put on a series of global events. We have a conference that we do in Houston, one in London, one in Canada, just spoke recently in Brazil. So when it comes to advanced work packaging and WorkFace planning, that's kind of our area of passion, and that's what we do. Steve, can I get you to go to the agenda for today? So what we're going to do today is talk about what the difference is between WorkFace planning, front-end planning, and advanced work packaging, because these terms get thrown around, but I think it's helpful to understand what the difference between them are. Next, we're going to talk about how AWP is different from traditional construction. And we're going to do that by having some examples and showing you how it would traditionally be done, on a pipe rack build, on vessel erection, and on program work, and how it would be done in an AWP environment. And Vince is going to speak to the vessel erection and the program work, and I will speak to the pipe rack build. Then we're going to talk about the benefits of advanced work packaging. Some of these are really well documented. They've had academic research applied to them. But I think the more interesting is some of the anecdotal. We've got a number of companies now that have been doing this for a while, and they've shared some of their successes, and I'll be talking to you about those. We also have some resources that we think would be quite useful to you, both from the Construction Industry Institute out of the University of Texas at Austin, and also out of the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, which is out of Edmonton, Alberta. And then finally, we're going to open it up to question and answer, and we should be giving you sufficient time to ask all the questions you want. Anything that doesn't get answered, we'll post it on the website and we'll respond to it that way. So Steve, would you mind moving into the presentation? So the first thing that we want to talk about is WorkFace planning. And there's a definition that WorkFace planning is the process of organizing and delivering all elements necessary before the work is started to enable craftspersons to perform quality work in a safe, effective, and efficient manner. So basically what we're saying is we want the construction crews to have everything they need to be productive on site. Now, that model came out a number of years ago, and it did show some pretty good improvements. But one of the problems is when it comes to things like materials, engineering, if we don't have it when we need it, then it's very hard to be effective on site. So there's some work that needs to be done before we can WorkFace plan if we're going to get full benefit. So next slide, Steve. These activities, we call them front-end planning. And that's basically where we're establishing how are we going to break up the project? Which packages are we going to build? When do we need the engineering? When do we need the procurement? And so those front-end planning activities are really critical because they determine the path of construction. In other words, the optimal way that we're going to build the project. So once we've done those things up front and we feed that information into WorkFace planning, next slide, we now are talking about advanced work packaging. And advanced work packaging involves all the front end work and it involves what we actually do at site. And those two together are a really powerful combination. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, Steve. So we thought the best way to do this was to take some real life scenarios, talk about how they would traditionally be done, and then talk about how advanced work packaging would do them a little bit differently. And then we can start talking about the benefits. So I'll take over by doing the process pipe rack first. So we're going to build a pipe rack. Now it could be a greenfield project, it could be a brownfield project, it really doesn't matter. When you look at the entire project, it will be broken into construction work areas. And these construction work areas are convenient ways to break up the project. And now we can start looking and saying, okay, in the area where the pipe rack is, do we have all of the materials on order? What's the current status? What's happening with the engineering, and so on. So when we're looking at the materials, the first thing we want to look at is the area that the build is going to go on. But then we want to start saying, okay, once I'm aware of where I'm going to build it, the next thing I want to look at is on a discipline by discipline basis, how are we doing? So construction work packages are packages that look at specific disciplines. There'll be ones for steel, there'll be ones for pipe, there'll be ones for electrical. And they will fall into the construction work area, but these area-based packages are going to typically be single discipline. Now, most projects will say when a CWP gets released, all of the materials that are associated with that CWP need to be there. But the reality is often that's not the case. Often things have been delayed and we want to get some work done, so we do a partial release. And when we do these partial releases, some of the materials that are showing in the CWP are often not there yet. They're still on order. We need to be very careful not to just look at the computer reports and say, okay, we've got the CWP, it's complete, we're good. We need to go right down to looking at an item by item basis and making sure that if anything wasn't shipped to us, that we're aware of it. Because the next size package we're going to look at are called installation work packages. And these are the packages that go to the crews to assist them when they're doing their work. Now, on bigger projects, we're going to see that these packages will typically be 1,000 to 2,000 hours of work. But if we're talking about smaller projects, the crew sizes will be smaller, the shift durations will be smaller. So the actual size of the packages has to make sense for what building you're doing. And when we talk about resource confirmation, especially materials, one of the best ways to do that is through bag and tag. So we look to see what does the package say that we need. We get down to a very granular level. We're looking now at everything that's required to do the build. And then we bag and tag those materials so that when we put them to the crews, they have everything they need to be able to do the construction. Now, what about those partial releases we talked about? What if there's some materials that aren't being released at this time? They're not there for the CWP. Well, what we want to do is take a look at the packages and say, do we really want to release the packages as are, or do we want to take those smaller crew level packages, the installation work packages, and do we want to amend those packages so that they are executable? So for example, if there's supposed to be some valves and the valves are missing and we're going to temporarily put a pup on them to allow us to continue the work, then we're going to have to build some new packages, and those packages will be to take out the pups and replace the valves at a later time. But what we want to do is we want to make the work that we're doing planned work. We don't want it to be work that's a surprise to anybody. We want it to be planned. And when we start looking at crews and crew productivity, we find that in traditional construction, a lot of time is spent looking for materials, trying to reallocate crews because some critical piece of material isn't there. And with advanced work packaging, we're really trying to make sure that everything the crews need to do the build is there, and it's identified. When there's a problem, we know about it right away, and we've got a plan B. So let's move to the next slide, Steve. So looking at safety, on a traditional project, we look at the construction work area, we look at the hazards that exist there so we can identify potential risks. And we come up with plans for how to deal with those risks. But the risks that we're talking about are quite broad and quite generic at that level. When we get to construction work package, we're now looking at discipline-specific work. And so some of the risks that might exist in one discipline may not exist in another. So for example, if we're looking at electrical packages, there may be issues around lockout tagout procedures that are really critical and will heavily impact safety. Other disciplines may have other specific risks associated with them. They need to be very familiar with what those risks are. But at the CWP level, what we don't know is exactly when the work is going to be executed. When we get down to the IWP level, the installation work packages, these crew level packages, we now know what the weather conditions are like. We now know what some of the site conditions are like. So the foreman can start to assess what the risk is for that work being performed at that time. I want to give an example of why this is so critical. On a project that was executed a few years ago, they had gone through and done all the WorkFace planning. They knew exactly what risks there were. They built the installation work packages. They were ready to execute. And they were doing some work on a tailings pond. And the tailings pond has a very fine silt in it. And the pumps that are used to circulate the water in the tailings ponds are subject to being clogged. And when they clog, even if it's the middle of winter, the water recirculates, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And if somebody isn't aware of that risk, they may uncouple the pump and find themselves scalded. That actually happened to 2 workers. They came back from the work being shut down for a while. They were instructed to remove some pumps, but nobody had identified for them this risk of the pumps overheating. When they did their post-incident event, they found that the IWPs that were originally created were never released because the work had been postponed. And they found that had they received those packages, they would have been aware of the risk and it would have been completely avoidable. So it's not only important that we think about safety at these different levels, but we need to drive it down to the crews so that they know exactly what's happening and how to keep themselves safe. And we've been able to see many projects where the number of injuries has dropped to 0, and that's where there's millions of man hours of work being done. So we've seen some really dramatic improvements in safety as a result of this. Next slide, Steve. False progress. What we're used to in traditional construction is progressing based on items. How many tons of steel did we put in? How many valves did we install? So we're looking at activities, but with advanced work packaging, we're actually looking at completed work packages. And this is important because when you have a number of activities that need to be completed in a package, and any of those activities aren't completed, you're not done. Whereas we also want to look at how are we progressing using traditional metrics. But once we've got a sense of how we're doing, we want to close off work. We want to say, this is completely finished. And what we find is often when you have to go back and complete some small piece of work, because you're doing it out of sequence, because you're doing it after the fact, it takes longer than originally planned. So there's a tendency to get a false sense of progress if all we look at is activities and not completed work packaging. The other thing is often inspections lag behind work. And in an AWP environment, we try to make sure that as soon as the work is done, it's inspected. And if there's a problem, we know exactly what that problem is, so that problem isn't continued to the next series of work items being done. And then finally, we've determined the path of construction. That's the optimal way of building this. Well, we want to make sure that all the work that we're doing is on that path of construction. In other words, we want to make sure that we're on our critical path. And if there's work that is not being done as per the path of construction, we may be getting productivity, but the productivity may not result in a lower total installed cost. And what we really are interested in doing is making sure that all the work we do is moving us towards a properly completed, lower cost, shorter duration project that is always safe. So these are some of the areas that advanced work packaging will help to give us better understanding of what's going on. Now, Steve, can you move to the next slide? And Vince is going to talk about some of the macro challenges in the workplace.
Well, thank you, Lloyd. And I'll tell you that I'm going to take a perspective from essentially a subcontractor perspective. That's the world I live in. And to kind of frame why I would take that perspective is we've been involved in AWP for the last 3 or 4 years, as we said early on. And one of the things we find as what I would call the quote soft craft provider is we are a very integral part of a project, but we're very low on the food chain, if you would, with regard to the whole IWP packaging process. And so a good example, a really good example of that is on the access side. So as all the IWP packaging process that Lloyd has been alluding to, it's a very detailed process. It's intended to remove all obstacles and ensure that all the available materials, everything is set up for success for that particular crew. When it gets down to that package building process, access could literally just be a constraint box, and it just gets checked. There's an actual deeper process that needs to be engaged to ensure that that constraint is resolved and that the scaffold has been designed, that scaffold has been approved, budgeted, requested, and built. And so there's a whole subset of tasks that become a little bit fuzzy on how that gets integrated and how that gets actually executed within this whole AWP framework. And so there's some real challenges out there to the subcontractor world to help bridge some of those gaps to make this a very fluid process, because ultimately, as Steve alluded to, it's about delivering a very safe, successful, low-cost project. And so if we can eliminate obstacles and make those transitions smoother, then we can collectively, achieve that goal. So to my bullets specifically here on this slide, I think it goes without saying that we've all experienced the fact that demand is far outpacing supply of manpower in the last few years with the onslaught of all of the major capital expansions, the LNGs, the ethylene expansions. The labor market is very stressed, to say the least. And so it ties right in and really amplifies the need for a system that will optimize crew productivity. We have to take the resources that we do have available and make them as productive as possible. And so the whole AWP concept, the WorkFace Planning, ties right in to helping facilitate that need to optimize the available workforce. And then in the middle here, we're talking about how do we improve the outcomes. So there are some unique challenges to people that live in our space, and I would even say that upstream, to the constructors, the EPCs. This is a new ecosystem that we have to live in. And so there's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of information sharing, there's a lot of platform adaptation that we all have to adjust to. So Steve will talk a little bit later about some maturity models, and I would say we're pretty early on in the, Lloyd will talk about it. We're very early in that maturity model, so we're learning as we go, and I can tell you our organization has been very active in it, and we recognize some challenges in interacting on a project that has AWP concepts, but it's very positive, and I'll show you a couple of illustrations here in a minute. And then lastly, the natural result is we are actually dealing in a very data-driven overabundance of data. We're drowning in data. So it's forcing organizations like ours and others to truly understand what is meaningful data, how do we utilize that data, how do we share that data, how do we integrate data. And another nuance could be that we're now having to probably disclose more of our business than you may feel comfortable doing, but we have to be willing to do that for the greater good. And I think what I'm seeing is we're finding a good balance of information sharing that's appropriate but not invasive, and it's yielding some pretty good results. So Steve, go ahead. So what I'm showing here on the left is just a theoretical project just to show some of the complexities in this ecosystem. So if you get on one of these large projects, it could be a joint venture. So you could have a couple of different owners joining together on this LNG project, or you just pick the scenario. And of course, they bring along their favorite EPCs, and you can see how this cascades down. That leads to more general contractors, more subcontractors, suppliers, vendors, etc. So this ecosystem gets very large very quickly. And again, AWP endeavors to help bring all of these resources and entities together in a common framework. And it's been a very challenging process. But as Lloyd alluded to, this is an endeavor that's been going on for 20 plus years. And so I would say it originated north of the border, and it's made its way into the States. And I would say that we're probably just in our first 3 or 4 years of adaptation here in the States. But again, it's been a very good effort. Here on the right side, kind of reconfirming what would have been a traditional approach when you didn't have an overarching AWP process. So engineering would have been selected in some sort of a project, and they would have gone about their business of designing. They would have done some front end, feed development, and then some more detailed design work, and they would go on their path, and they would ultimately deliver a product. And then somewhere in that process, procurement would get involved, and they would start ordering materials, long lead items, and whatever falls in their bailiwick. And then construction gets called in a little bit later in the game, and they have their set of priorities. They're trying to understand the project, the design, the engineering, the procurement process, but it's not connected. So what we're just illustrating here is everybody's ultimately getting to the end, but it's very disjointed, which would explain why Lloyd was commenting earlier that you may have the majority of your materials available in a construction work package, but you may not have all. So you have to be a little more discreet about how you can actually take what you do have available and assemble that into a usable IWP so that you can make guys productive. But within an ecosystem that's managed correctly from the front end, then you start aligning engineering, procurement, and construction. So you have less of that reactive type work and going to plan B and C if you don't have to. You have a more programmatic approach that supports the path of construction and sets everybody up for success. So that's really the story here. So go ahead, Steve. And you can go ahead on into the next slide. So I'll use one example, and this is a real world example of a project that we're engaged in right now. So these conversations are being had currently, and that's about some vessels for a new expansion project in a major facility. And so you have a couple of options are being discussed. One would be to go ahead and erect it. So Steve, scenario one, well, option one would be to dress it in place. And so there are some considerations to be had there, and that is, what is the schedule impact of doing that? We can go ahead and get the vessel placed now instead of later. So there could be some crane cost associated. There's a lot of things that go into that decision. But of course you have it scaffold in place. You have people working at heights. You have other things to consider. And so I'll tell you that one is not a viable option for this project. So option two is we do it in the horizontal. So what makes this conversation unique is that we're looking at it from two perspectives. One is if they allow us to do the installation first before they dress the vessel. And we're doing an economic exercise to look at viability between options 2 and 3. So option 2 is that we insulate it first. We have optimal productivity, which is good for me, but we also recognize that we're going to most likely have some mechanical damage when they start hanging all of the landings and all the pipe, all the instrumentation, everything that's going to subsequently follow our activities. And so we're going to have to allow for that, which we're currently doing, and we'll put a budget against the repair work, and then we'll do a composite drive out cost with all of the other crafts engaged in that process. So option 3, Steve, is we do the installation last, which is not necessarily desirable for me because now I have a productivity impact because I'm now working around all those platforms and pipes, but I eliminate the damage. So I make one pass through this vessel and I'm complete, albeit at a lower productivity rate. But the offset to that is now we probably have some productivity bumps on the other trades because they don't have to work as delicately around an insulated surface. So again, it's all about that collaboration. It's about trying to identify that total drive out cost. What is the best solution for this particular project? We haven't arrived at that answer. We're very close, but the key here is, Steve, the main thing is we're looking for the optimal project solution. And this AWP framework, the spirit of collaboration, it allows us to do that in a very proactive way before the vessels actually hit the ground. So very positive. It's an interesting concept, and it's been well adopted and accepted. So next one. So program work can mean a lot of things. Generally within a facility, you're going to have several programs that work on a routine basis and generally year round. And those can be, I'm going to use an example of exchanger programs. That could also be corrosion under insulation or CUI. There's multiple programs that work in various facilities that have a need and an order of magnitude that could benefit from WorkFace planning and the whole AWP construct in and of itself. But relative to exchanger programs that we engage with in various facilities, smart 3D models are very beneficial if those exist. They don't always, but if they do, then they can facilitate some of your front-end budgeting processes, because I can go to the model and I can extract a lot of relevant data, and not just myself, all the other disciplines. So I can understand the metallurgy, I can understand coating requirements, insulation requirements. I can get my flange sizes, I can get all the dimensions and things that I need to put a valid budget together. And then we can also integrate other needs, other disciplines. We can do some virtual WorkFace planning. We can incorporate the scaffold design around this vessel so that we can get approval on that. There's a lot of things that we can do. It could facilitate inspections and inspection records if those details are available. So again, it can become a central repository for information to be shared, consumed, used, evaluated, confirmed. There's a lot of interaction that can take place from a modeling perspective. And so Steve, on the next slide, what we're showing here is that there's not always a 3D model in some of these existing facilities that are older, which that's a lot of our facilities here in the States. And so what we're seeing a lot of customers going to now is laser scanning of their assets. We've seen facilities do an entire facility-wide scan of all of their units. We've seen them do unit-specific or asset-specific. In this case, this was a unit laser scan survey that we did for a customer. And there's a lot of benefits to a laser scan as opposed to a 3D model. And one of the biggest benefits is that in a laser scan, you see the true as-built configuration and the environment that you'll be working in. And that assists in a lot of ways. Not only can I still go ahead and do virtual planning and interact with other disciplines, I can get accurate measurements straight from here. And I can also see the environment, so I understand if I have sensitive equipment in the area that I need to take into consideration as I'm building my plan. Any emergency situations that we think might arise. You could have hot surfaces that you wouldn't recognize from a 3D model that you could see in a laser scan. There's a lot of advantages to looking at a laser scan model. And of course, I don't show an option C here, but a traditional approach would be that neither of those are available. And then you would still deploy good WorkFace planning protocol. And that would generally mean that the group of disciplines that would be involved in the process could do a joint walk and take a look at the facility, take a look at the exchangers in question, get all the dimensions and agree on the scope of work. It's more manual. So visualization goes a long ways, and that's our preferred method when it comes to WorkFace planning, is to have some visualization available to us. So those are a couple of scenarios that we've experienced along the way where we're taking our technology. So there's things that we're doing within our organization to allow us to do things like place the scaffold in this model so that we can get virtual acceptance. And so how we endeavor to bring value to the customer is, if we can agree to access needs and designs up front virtually, then that eliminates some of the rework and some of the modifications that we're currently experiencing, which again achieves the end goal, and that's reducing cost on the project. So Steve, go ahead. I think it's over to you now, Lloyd.
And I'll
Sorry,
just
I was talking to myself, but I was on mute. Uh, Thanks, Vince. Appreciate that. I'll walk us through the benefits. And one of the challenges, I think everybody has talked to someone who said, oh yeah, I tried AWP and it didn't work. So one of the things we have to consider is the maturity of your AWP program. And in the RT272 documentation, there's a 2-page document, which is the AWP implementation maturity model. Now, if anybody wants that and doesn't have a copy of that one document, send us an email and we will fire you off that one particular document. But basically, there's 3 levels in the maturity. There's the early stages, there's effectiveness, and there's business transformation. This 2-page document is really easy to understand, so I recommend you take a look at it after this webinar. Steve, next slide. So when we first start to implement advanced work packaging, we're in the early stages. We're targeting small project goals. We've got budgets for specific projects. We're trying to implement this, but we really are doing it almost on an ad hoc basis. And I'd like you to think about, for the golfers out there, if somebody comes to you and says, I've got a swing and it's going to improve your golf game immensely, when you first switch from the way you're used to doing it to this new way, generally people's golf game gets worse, not better. Once you get that stroke down, once you understand how to use it, when to use it, then you will start to see it improve your game. And once it's second nature to you, then you know exactly how to do it, when to do it, why to do it. So what we're doing in the early stages is we're establishing a baseline for ourselves. We're putting some small goals together. We're establishing how we're going to do AWP, but it's probably project by project. Next slide, Steve. When we get to effectiveness, we've now started to really understand AWP. We're setting some more ambitious goals for ourselves. We're looking to make further improvements. We're really coming up with good guidelines. And if you look at those 6 progress indicators, our productivity improves, our cost improves, our safety improves, our schedule improves, our predictability improves, and our quality improves. So once we get good at advanced work packaging, we have well-documented research to show that all of the traditional project indicators will tend to improve as we improve in our maturity. Next slide, Steve. Once we've really got a good AWP system together, we can start working on how to extend this, expand it. And what we see is all the benefits that we got in productivity, cost, safety, and schedule are maintained, but we get even further benefits in terms of increased predictability and improved quality, which results in reduced rework. So we know from some pretty good academic research that was actually used to make advanced work packaging CII's latest best practice that this works. What I want to do is take you to specific owners and specific results. So next slide, Steve. We talked to some owners and we said, you know, what's been your experience? And one owner, I can't give you the name, did about a dozen projects and they applied advanced work packaging. And the traditional way that they did their projects was engineering would be almost complete before they'd start construction, and then construction would be almost complete before they started commissioning. what they're doing now is they're breaking it into work areas, and they're making sure that the engineering for a work area is complete before they start construction, before they start commissioning. On the dozen projects they've done, they found that every single project had schedule compression. Every single project got done earlier than originally planned by using this AWP concept. And the schedule compression happened at the same time that costs went down. So for one owner, it's only 12 projects, but all 12 of them came in under schedule and under budget. Next slide, Steve. So we talked to some owners and we said, you know, tell us what you've experienced because of advanced work packaging. And I'm just going to go through a few of these, but the first is a number of the owners have experienced TRIF rates of 0. That means nobody was experiencing lost safety time, got hurt on the job, and this is where there were millions of man hours of work done. So I think that's pretty incredible. The companies that have told us this said this has actually exceeded their expectations. Even though they all have 0 incidents as their goal, actually seeing it happen on millions of man hours of work was impressive to them. And the next thing, one of the owners found that their rework dropped to less than 1%. And it was basically by pulling up the safety inspections, doing them more quickly, they found things that meant that further mistakes weren't made. So that under 1% rework was really surprising for them, but definitely realized. Another cost one is that for a series of projects, not for a specific project, but for a series of projects, they received an 11% cost underrun for this program. So, and this was the case where there was a dozen projects. So just imagine you do a dozen projects, varying sizes, and you come in 11% under budget. That is spectacular. And this is what's driving the owners to continue doing this. Next slide, Steve. In terms of productivity, one of the owners indicated they had 2 virtually identical projects. One of them they used AWP on, the other one they didn't. They got a 25% bump in productivity. That to them was pretty impressive. One of the other things is with this AWP system, if it's done right, we can actually streamline the whole turnover progress system to mechanical completion. So it's one thing to mechanically complete, but if we can't commission our systems and start up our systems in an efficient manner, then we still have problems. And the owners have found that this has helped them with that. Now, Vince was talking about this from a contractor perspective, so let's look at what the contractors found. One of the first things they found was good advanced work packaging allowed them to reduce the number of HSE exposure hours. So if they can remove people from unsafe situations or minimize the time in unsafe situations, then that naturally will flow through to fewer safety near misses and fewer safety incidents. The other thing that the builders found was that using an AWP system, they were able to reduce their punch list items on virtually identical work by 95%. So they finish a package, they look for deficiencies, they clear those deficiencies, and that process is built right in. So because they're doing it so quickly, they're finding that when they actually are ready to commission systems, the punch lists are extremely small. Now, something you need to be aware of, that an AWP system will probably show a slight increase in engineering costs and a slight increase in procurement costs. 1% increase in engineering, 0.1% increase in procurement. But that's offset by an 11% reduction in construction costs. So most of the money is going to construction, and we're able to, for very small increases in engineering and procurement, see very big increases in construction cost savings. Steve, can I get you to move to the next slide? The other thing that we found is contractors are telling us that they've been able to get up to 25% increases in productivity in certain disciplines. And as Vince said, in some disciplines, we may actually see that their productivity will decline a little bit because another craft needs to have access. And what we're really interested in is improving the overall project, not necessarily improving every single craft. And probably the biggest thing that we heard from a series of builders was, if you're good at advanced work packaging, if you're good at WorkFace planning, and you get great results for the owners, it does result in additional work. And that's probably been the biggest driver for the companies that have adopted AWP. We know of a number of owners now that have basically said to their contractors, if you don't do advanced work packaging, you probably don't want to bother bidding because you won't make it through our bidding process. And just in case you think that that's not a factual statement, Exxon, Shell, Dow have all made that statement to their contractors, because they've now been doing this enough that they've seen the benefits and they've decided that that's how they want to do their projects. There's something I want to talk about before we get out of benefits. You may get the impression that this only works for very large projects, but what we're seeing is advanced work packaging is being used on big projects, small projects. As Vince showed you, it's being done on program work. So a lot of the things that you might think, well, yeah, you do that on a really big project, but you wouldn't do it on a smaller one. We actually have just recently had the scalability team at COA report out, and they've got some documentation that might be quite interesting to you. So Steve, can you move to the next slide? So if you're interested in finding out more about advanced work packaging, the Construction Industry Institute out of the University of Texas at Austin has a series of documents, and there's a link there to how you can get those. If you are a CII member, those are free. If you're not, then there is a cost associated with getting them. But this will be in the package that we're sending out to you. And this will help you understand how it works and how to implement it. Next slide, Steve. I talked about scalable. There was a 2-year study that just recently ended in May of last year, and April of last year. And this report is available in the COA library, and it's available free of charge. So all you have to do is go to COA and download it, and it'll provide you with some insight on how to use AWP on projects 100 million and less. Next slide, Steve. The team also developed a screening tool that allows you to determine what type of project that you're dealing with in that under 100 million category. And that tool is also available free of charge from the COA library. So strongly recommend you take a look at those tools. And now we'll move to the Q&A portion of this. So when you send us questions, Steve, could you tell them how to do that?
Absolutely. So we've already had a couple of question submissions, which is great. And basically, we ask you to look for the Q&A button on your attendee panel and submit the question there. Our panelists, Lloyd and Vince, can see your questions. And I think if it's okay with you, Lloyd, I'll toss the first question out for addressing. And if you like, we can start with Vince and go to you afterward.
Sure, that's great.
The first, okay, awesome. The first question here, Stuart White from Kiewit asks, for the audience, can you discuss how data and systems integration facilitates constraint management and how that is important throughout the supply chain when implementing AWP?
So your order that I heard you say earlier is you'd like me to comment, then Lloyd. So data and system integration and constraint management, those are unique challenges for sure, as I alluded to in my portion, because of where we sit in the food chain. And it's a very important piece, and I'll tell you that we generally handle it on an external basis, meaning that constraint resolution still has a little ways to go within some of the programmatic AWP solutions like a Construct Sim. They're very robust programs, but what we end up doing is we end up sharing information back and forth. Through their package building process, they'll identify a need for access, and then that has to flag us. That has been a challenge into how we're going to do that. So it generally ends up being some sort of SharePoint site and an Excel document because they're going to manage literally thousands of packages over a life of a project. I need a way to quickly filter to the ones that have an access need. And so we take and consume those, interact with those, publish information back to that SharePoint site, and then they can integrate that back into their packaging process. So that's how we interact with it at the subcontractor level.
Great. And I'll just add my comments that there's an initiative within the Construction Industry Institute to develop AWP data specifications. And there's a team that's been busily working on this since October of last year. They've started to issue some of these data specifications. And I think that this should help us with the whole area of constraint management, because what's been happening is each organization has their own way of identifying things, and it makes it very difficult for developers to come up with something that translates from one company to the next. These specifications that they're creating should allow us to have standards out there that go across different owners and different EPCs and other contractors. So we should be hearing about this in August at a report out that CII is doing on this topic area, and then again in October at the AWP conference, where we're going to be highlighting this as well. But I think the data specifications are going to help enormously with this.
Perfect. We do have a quick question here actually from Milford Posey that I will answer briefly. We will make the presentation available to all registrants, that is all that attended live today, as well as those who registered but were unable to attend.
Great.
And sorry about my my internet connection there. And we will also share the slides in PDF format, so watch for that on the AWP Community of Practice group on LinkedIn. Next question. We would like to hear thoughts about the quality of schedule data required at or on site being an issue. Too often projects see week schedules changing all the time, home office schedules not matching job site schedules, etc. How can that be improved? When done right, things are brought in the right order. This was submitted by an anonymous attendee. Vince?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep answers a little more brief just because the questions are piling up and I'm trying to be sensitive to people's time.
Sure.
Generally speaking, we're starting to see improvement. And I agree 100%. There's a time and a place for a schedule, and everybody just assumes that a schedule is going to fall apart on the second shift of any particular project. And it's generally a lagging indicator type schedule. But what we are seeing are improvements of process. And I think that's because of the total integration of the whole AWP ecosystem, where you're getting live updates being done in a central repository. So naturally schedules will shift just due to progress of other dependent tasks or availability of materials or whatever those drivers may be. But we're seeing those changes real time, and they're at a much more macro level, or a more micro level actually. So we're experiencing a little bit more dependable workflow and headcount consumption. So we're seeing the improvement, but I think it's attributable to improvements in the programs that are being utilized to facilitate AWP projects.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think the other thing is we need to let the contractors determine which packages they're going to execute based on site conditions and other things. When it comes to the owners and the management team, we need to roll up the installation work packages into construction work packages, and we need to make sure that the construction work packages and the IWPs are showing up on as a roll-up to the level 3 schedule. So if I'm an owner, I don't really want to know which particular package you've executed today, but I do want to know if we're still on schedule and if we're moving ahead. So I think we're starting to see CWPs and IWPs showing up in the schedules, and that makes it a lot easier to have that control. Next question.
Sure. I'm wondering, if you're able to browse the questions, Lloyd, did you want to select one? As Vince mentioned, they're piling up, which is
Sure.
great. But
well,
okay.
let me go ahead. I'm going to jump in, and so this question by Tan here about the EPCs and the details down to the IWP level. We're on a large project with a major owner in the Houston area currently, and that one's not really a solution. It all comes down to us being provided the IWP and the CWP structure from our customer, and we attach those, because I agree, we do live at a much more detailed level than the EPC does. The example I always use is I live in a level 5 world and they live in a level 3 relative to like scheduling, because that's where I have to live at. But what we do is we attach the IWPs and CWPs as attributes to all of our detailed work activities. So I'm able to roll those up to an IWP or a CWP or a CWA level and report back to them in an aggregate, per whatever level of breakdown. So again, it's a collaboration of sharing of information and understanding the WBS of the project. And then there has to be a commitment on the part of the subcontractor to be able to support that, that WBS. If that answers the question.
Yeah, and I don't have anything to add to that. I think that was a great answer. So I'll take Paola's question. How can modularization be implemented in conjunction with advanced work packaging? And I think what we're seeing is it's two-stage answer. When we get to the mod shops that are actually building the modules, they are using advanced work packaging principles, and they're also using lean principles to build those modules off-site. Then when the modules come to site, the connections on the modules and the work that's done to install the modules is also handled through installation work packages. So modularization is just one of the components that helps us to take costs off-site, hopefully reduce them significantly, and then speed up the installation process. Vince, any additional comments?
I had to unmute, but no, not really. But I will say that we just recently finished up a project that was modular, that was done with AWP. And I didn't really see a difference because you're still bringing in components, whether those are stick-built components or modular components. And those parts are still managed within the ecosystem. We are addressing, the tie-in connection points as opposed to all of the field run assets. So it's really about just identifying the work breakdown structure and all the assets within those areas. And I don't see a real distinct difference between a modular project and a stick built.
I agree. So we're actually at 11 o'clock. I think we can answer a couple more questions, but if anybody needs to leave because we're at the end time, that's fine. We'll probably run about 5 minutes over. And we will try and answer some of these questions that we don't get to after the fact. So one of the questions that we were asked was, I was wondering if you could discuss similarities and overlaps of AWP and the Lean Construction Institute's last planner system. And I think that's a great question because there are people who believe that, oh, well, we're using advanced work packaging, so that means Lean doesn't apply to us. I don't believe that's true. I believe that the Lean principles can be very useful in certain places, and the advanced work packaging principles can be very useful. Both principles have some advantages that the other one doesn't have. So for example, if you're interested in, war rooms and how to set up for interactive planning at a very detailed level, Lean has some great points on that. When it comes to the Lean process, they tend not to use work packages. They're now looking at instituting work packages in Lean construction. So I think there are a number of delivery systems out there that have some really valid areas. And by coordinating and working together, I think we can build out all of those delivery systems. Vince, any thoughts or comments on that?
No, I think you covered that one very adequately.
Okay, so did you want to pull another one from the list, Vince, to tackle?
Let's see. I saw one as I was scrolling up and down. I had to go back and look at it, and it was near and dear to my heart because it asked specifically about the scaffolding in the IWPs, and so it's kind of a trailer to my earlier comments and response, and it's very specific because we all recognize in our industry that scaffolding is a huge constraint. What we tell people is, we may only be 20% of the hours, but we impact 80% of the project. And I think everybody agrees with that. So the way we're currently doing it is, and I defined it somewhat a little earlier, is first off, we need to understand that there is a need, and then we will do a scaffold design that facilitates that need. And then we feed that information back into to that particular IWP planner on the customer's behalf. And what's really critical at that point is, number one, is that they incorporate that scaffold design and those scaffold budgets into their IWP. And if you're, and most scaffold contractors are consistent in that they're going to associate scaffold tag numbers with their scaffolds. So one of the little nuances that creates issues on a project is we go through the front end planning, and then somebody identifies that need for that scaffold out in the field months later, and they just put in a scaffold request for a scaffold at a location. And it creates a lot of busy work unnecessarily when it could have been avoided if we just have good communication. So back to my scenario is, you have a need identified, I respond back, I give you my scaffold tag number or numbers associated with that IWP. Then when you do a request for that IWP, when that mechanical guy gets ready to go to the field, he can actually request my scaffolds by their tag IDs, and that streamlines my process. I can go ahead and print out my work packages. I can issue my materials needs to my yard and help this. So that's the way we interact with a constraint for scaffolds in an IWP.
So one thing I would like to say at this point is, and I've been a proponent of this for years, there were sort of two schools of thoughts when it came to scaffolding. One is that it's a commodity, and that the people that plan scaffolding aren't WorkFace planners. The other is that the scaffolding actually connects a bunch of trades together, and they are absolutely WorkFace planners. I am a very strong proponent of the second view. I think if we just think of scaffolding as a commodity, we're losing a lot of opportunities. And with it being such a big cost to a project, I think you need to get your scaffolding done as an extra trade planning, and you need to have them part of the team. So I think if you want to get full benefit, you want to make sure that your scaffolding provider is working as a WorkFace planner and as part of your planning team. So we're actually quite a bit behind on the questions. There were 15 questions, and I'm okay with answering a few more. How are you doing, Vince? So, do you have another few minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So another question we got asked was, we are a very large electrical contractor. I am implementing a custom version of AWP on Microsoft Project Online. We build the path of construction down to the IWP level, and this includes a constraint management view. I use software because it's scalable, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the approach. So they're using P6 and a RACI diagram. What are your thoughts on that, Vince?
From my perspective, I don't think the platform really matters as long as you're following good logical protocol. Again, with the end result in mind, you're trying to build logical work packages that are the right size for the type of work and the disciplines at hand and the size of your project. So that if this allows this particular contractor to follow the proper protocol, and it allows him to scale up and down across the projects that he deems suitable for this type of management, then I can't see anything negative about it. The only, I guess, caution I would throw out there is if it's compromising any of the processes along the way. But it sounds like it's fully covered when he talks about getting it all the way down to the IWP, and especially with regard to constraint management. You know, to me, that's a big deal. I alluded to it earlier. That's where I think there's still some room for improvement, or there's still some fruit to be picked, is that instead of just checking a box as a constraint, there has to be some way of validating that that constraint has been resolved, and that could, in some instances, be a simple process, or it could be a complex RFI resolution type process. So constraint management is a big one. So it looks to me like it's covered here.
Yeah, I would say the same. And I think we've got some great tools out there. Number of companies have put together some great tools, but they're tools. You need to have good underlying processes that the tools support. So whether you're using Microsoft Project, or whether you're using ConstructSim, or whether you're using BIM 360, or you know, Smart Construction, I think the tool is going to help you, but it's the underlying processes that are going to make it work for you.
Yep.
So I think we got time for one more question. Which one do we want to take, Vince? I'll give you the last selection.
Well, I'm going to throw one out there that's not necessarily my expertise, but it was the next question in line, and that's how to include the procurement process in the AWP. Do the package order process sometimes includes several construction work packages? And the reason I resonate with that is we also, again, I can tie this back to the scaffold world that we live in. You end up with these many-to-one relationships and these interdependencies that become a challenge into how to manage that. So I get the gentleman's reason for asking the question. They're going to order materials and equipment in bulk, as opposed to per package in the bag and tag. Bag and tag happens at the site level after you bring in work, bulk items. So this is really about, it's more of a data exercise. So I think that we're okay to say that procurement is part of AWP, and we're going to roll up a bill of materials that some procurement person could order in bulk, and we have to understand how we demonstrate that one bulk order is facilitating the needs of multiple CWPs or multiple IWPs. So it really becomes just a data mapping exercise. So procurement is definitely an integral part of AWP, but how do we manage those interdependencies? I don't think that riddle is totally solved, and it is more of a data management challenge than anything else.
Totally agree with you on that. I think that how we order the materials will change a little bit, because one of the things that we did a study a little while back to see how many companies were including in their contracts with vendors data standard requirements and information requirements, and only about 30% of the orders that were going out actually specified the corresponding data that they needed to support the materials. And I think we're going to see that will change over time, that if we're going to manage these things, we have to have consistent ways of describing them, and we have to be able to allocate those, whether they're tagged items or not. We need to be able to allocate them down to IWPs. And as Vince said, when you've got thousands of these things going, it becomes really important that we've got that data management side taken care of. Mm-hmm. So I really want to thank everybody. We had tons of great questions. We had pretty good attendance, I think, for the session. And we'd love to hear from you if there are certain topic areas that you would like us to make a point of setting up. At one webinar a week, we're really looking for you to tell us what you want to know more about. So please send us information on what you'd like to see additional sessions on. And we're going to be starting to post 4 events in advance what's coming up. So that should allow people to start planning this as a regular activity. But thanks again for everybody for attending. And Vince, thanks for agreeing to help with this. And you did a spectacular job. So real pleasure working with you on this.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you inviting.
Well, thanks to everybody. And we will now close down the webinar.